نتكلم الآن عن المشهد الفني السعودي على الخارطة العالمية. الكثير من التغيرات العميقة طرأت على المشهد الفني السعودي في السنوات العشر الأخيرة. في هذه الجلسة نتناول أهم التطورات في موقع السعودية على خارطة العالم الفني. تتحدث فيها الدكتورة فينيشا بورتر، القيمة الفنية للفن الإسلامي والمعاصر للشرق الأوسط في المتحف البريطاني، والثنائي سام وتل، القيمان الفنيان لتدير حوارهما مستشارة وزارة الثقافة علياء السنوسي. Enjoy the talk.
Thank you. Welcome to our afternoon session. Kind of quite a nice segue from the conversation before, which was conducted in Arabic for some of you who are here, and of course translated and available online in English, about really the historical context of what's happening here in Saudi Arabia. And this morning, if you will have listened to the making of the Biennale behind the scenes with Philip Tanari, Wijdan Rida, Ayel Bakri, and Kulabat Yantrasast. And you'll have heard that it was very important for the curators of this Biennale to illustrate that this is not out of nowhere, that the work that we're seeing here, of course, some of it is new, some of it is commissioned, but there are artists who have been working and researching and a part of this world for many years, many decades. And so what I'd love is for you to hear from three of the global figures who have been instrumental in particularly, the last 15 years and more in Venetia's case, and Sam and Till, their recent exhibition at 2139, and Venetia's upcoming one, which will be, the kind of, let's say, link through it all. But Dr. Vinisha Porter, a kind of wonderful figure who has been instrumental to so many of the artists and curators and patrons and figures in the region as an interlocutor for them here amongst each other, but also in a global context. So Vinisha, please kind of talk us through that very first moment that we wanted to start with, Word into Art in 2006. And of course it didn't come out of nowhere, but that's the point that we've decided to start with.
Okay, well thank you very much for this lovely introduction, and it's just such a huge pleasure to be here. It feels honestly like we are walking through history right now. It's just quite extraordinary. And so it's a huge privilege, really, to be here and to also have been coming to Saudi Arabia for all these last years. And each time, I learn something new, and it's just absolutely wonderful. So I wanted, could I have the first slide, please? Or do I do it? Maybe that's what cannot be overestimated, really, is the impact that this incredible exhibition had as far as making the work of Saudi Arabian artists really, really well known. And it's not as though there wasn't anything going on here at all. I mean, there's been a mass of art going on, and some of this was discussed in the previous panel. But the impact of this exhibition in London was quite remarkable, because it was, first of all, the works were completely extraordinary and new to so many people. And the second was how the works were presented and all of the kind of PR around it. I mean, I will never forget going on the London Underground and seeing this enormous picture of one of Riemann Faisal's Hajj series that was in there. I mean, that was just absolutely mind-blowing. And people just didn't, we've talked about Saudi Arabia, perceptions of Saudi Arabia. People had no idea that there was art. Of course, there's utter ignorance in the West. As usual, but it was really extraordinary. This was a very, very important moment in time. There was a kind of unlocking. I think I see it as. But in terms of my own,
and especially, I mean, in the context of London as almost an extension of an Arab city or a Middle Eastern city, or in Muslim culture in so many different parts of it. So to have Edge of Arabia at SOAS in London was almost showing it to a local audience in a way that hadn't seen it even here.
Yes, it was that, and I think what people saw was on the one hand artists engaging with tradition, but also working on an extraordinary range of topics. And I'm hoping the next slide. Yes, so in terms of my own engagement with this material, so I've been at the British Museum a long time, and so I kind of straddle Islamic art and contemporary Middle Eastern art, and I will never forget the moment when Stephen Stapleton, who was absolutely the kind of key person as far as Edge of Arabia is concerned, brought this work to me. I was actually in the midst of preparing the exhibition Word into Art, which was in 2006, and suddenly he appeared with this work. Would this be of interest for the museum? And it was like, wow, what is this? And so this is Ahmed Matar. So this is one of his very early works, and suddenly to hear that, he'd been instrumental in the work in this Al-Miftaha village, but he was a doctor and an artist, and you can completely see that in this work. There are the X-rays, and then all fragments of his medical textbooks and all of that. And
it was also at the time when I think a lot of people, didn't understand in the Western context that artists, also had day jobs here. That they weren't able to, survive or support themselves solely by their artistic practice. And it didn't seem like a feasible life option. And I think in some ways, speaking to the prejudice also in the West, is that, well, if you're not an artist all the time, then that means you're not really an artist.
Exactly.
Not understanding the context of that.
Yeah, I think that's it, exactly. So we acquired this work, and you're going to see Ahmed Matar again. I think I'm proud to say that this may be the British Museum's first institution that his work came into. So, so then the next, if I can make this happen, could you just move this for me? So then the second work that we acquired, which went straight into the Word into Art exhibition, is Faisal Samra, whose work we see in the Biennale. This is an extraordinary work called Text Body. It's a kind of sculptural piece. He's one of the great figures too, and all these letters and numbers and so on. This was really fascinating, actually. So out of 72 artists, or 74, I think it was, in Word into Art, there were two Saudi artists. I think so then the next...
The premise of the show, maybe just kind of explain a little bit in the context of the British Museum, and we wanted to talk also about the difference between working in a collecting institution as opposed to what we see in an exhibition, or for example, the yearly 2139, or for what we have here as a Biennale, and that each has its own role and context for artists and for presenting their work. And for an artist to be given the opportunity to show at the British Museum, one of the great world encyclopedic museums with such history and standing, I think is also very different than having, of course, a wonderful opportunity to be at Edge of Arabia, but then a kind of another level of that.
Well, I think the thing about it is that works were entering the collection, and that's really important. And Word into Art was like 85-90% the British Museum's collection, and this is essentially a collection of work on paper. Although you've seen two examples that are not paper, and that collection, has been built progressively over the years, and so that was what we were actually showcasing, was acquiring these works, putting them into the collection where they are, forever. And then, so this is this takes us to another project, many years later, the Hajj exhibition that I curated in 2012. That was an extraordinary adventure, because it started at the British Museum, and then it had different iterations at the Institut du Monde Arabe, Doha, in Leiden, and then eventually in Abu Dhabi. And the thing that I knew right at the beginning when I was curating this exhibition is that Hajj isn't something over there. Hajj is something living, breathing now, and I needed to have contemporary artists in that part of telling the story. And I knew that there were two works. As a curator, you have to start somewhere. And the two objects I knew that I had to have was the Maqamat of Hariri in the Bibliothèque Nationale and Ahmed Matar's Magnetism. And those were the two works that actually framed, in a sense, the exhibition. So, and this, we'll see that in a second. So, this is what I found contemporary artists. We acquired them for the collection for the most part. That contemporary take on a subject of the gathering of people coming to Mecca. I love this work. It's based on this is Malcolm X's story, and the way he was completely blown away. We were all brothers together. He was so unused to this idea. This was something very important. A beautiful work. This. If I could just master this clicker, I feel as though the life would improve a little bit here. Yes, and this is showing you a kind of juxtaposition. So we have Maham Al-Louh, this beautiful work, one of her early photograms, Road to Mecca. You see, actually, I don't know if you can see it there, but so clever in the background. She's got the fabric of the kiswa, and then people going, like she's used toys and so on. And so we juxtaposed it with the Kulliyat Saadi from the British Library. There, people all, like, the big section of the exhibition was the journey, people moving.
And then just the concept, though, of, the concept of kind of including, this iconic work that we see in the others at a time when the idea of going to Saudi really was only for Hajj. I mean, Saudi was closed for any other purpose. I mean, it was impossible getting visas. I mean, the early days of Edge of Arabia and then Saudi Art Council shows. I mean, we talked a little bit about this in the first talk this morning. And you mounting a show about an important, yes, living, breathing, journey of one's life, but in a place that to so many was so closed off. And even to Saudis themselves who wouldn't put art into the context of that journey.
Yes, exactly. And a lot of people were, why, for Muslims, like, why do you want to do an exhibition about Hajj? Like, we know everything about Hajj. It's not a topic for an exhibition, but, I think we managed to convince them. So, I mean, this work was utterly extraordinary. When you think of the magnet is literally this size, and the magic of what Ahmed did there. For those of you who haven't seen it, it's two magnets, one at the top and one underneath, and then these iron filings that are all around it. The minute you put the two pieces of magnet together, it's as though these iron filings actually like stand up. And we had a very freaky thing happened actually as the exhibition progressed, because the floor was a little bit bouncy where we had it. Was these magnets were getting closer and closer to it's as though they were walking close to the magnet there, and we just weren't sure whether they would last separated until the end of the exhibition. Then we acquired these, so these are prints that he made of that you see everywhere, of course, even actually when you come to the airport at Jeddah, there's one of them I noticed. And then Nasser al-Salim, we acquired this work we had in a little adjunct exhibition, Zamzam. So beautiful that you just see this, that he's just simply writing the word Zamzam for the well, and how lovely that is. And
Zamzam, for those of you who don't know, Venetia?
Zamzam is the well, the really important well, and in the Haram of Mecca, and to get the water of Zamzam is a real barakah. So actually, I just wanted to show you. So this isn't a work that we acquired, but it just shows you how extraordinary it is that you can tell that story of people converging, and then actually the importance that the Mecca is only for Muslims, but how it's done in this actually very wonderful way. It really was like the barrier from the end of one section and into another, and then so that was Hajj, and then this is the last project, Reflections, really, which is so these are works we've been acquiring over a number of years. I just want to show you a couple of examples. So this is an exhibition just recently, and these are early works by Dana Wartani, who's absolutely unbelievable work is here in the Biennale. And of course, she trained, as I'm sure you all know, at the Prince's School of Traditional Arts in London, and she learned illumination. And it's a very, very complicated skill. She would go back to her teacher in Istanbul as well, and so she created, this is 3 out of 6. And then the next one, Lul wal Humud. Again, we see some extraordinary work by her. So she's been, she translates, she has created codes which are representations of the 99
which
names
have
of
just
God.
been completed and showing here.
She's
the
done,
finally
she's done the 99.
completed
Yes.
99 names are here at the Biennale.
Yes.
So
Yes.
here we are.
Here we are, and just the last couple, I think, if I can. Yes, we also acquired these beautiful photographs by Emi Kat, wonderful, wonderful photographer who was on residency in Balad and created extraordinary photographs that we included in the exhibition. And the last work, actually, Manal Douyan, again, we've seen her in here. And this was a very, very important series. If I forget you, don't forget me. And it was like her exploration into her history. She wanted to understand about the life of her family and people around them. And I just love this phrase from her. How does one stop the act of forgetting? How do you capture a moment that existed 50 years ago in Saudi Arabia? And I love the way particularly artists speak about their work and, you know, and their story. So these are just 3 different moments in time.
So I think, you know, a kind of wonderful branching off point then is about how these artists were then shown in an international context, but then in conversation with, you know, international artists or Middle Eastern artists in the case of, for example, Reflections, but also in the context of an institution and your conversations with them in that way. And so I think if we, you know, kind of talk to Sam and tell a little bit about your work and then have a conversation of all 3 of you, of your experiences. But Sam and Till, I mean, you in a very different way, but yet also parallel to Venetia, have been exploring what is happening here in Saudi Arabia in the greater region. And, you know, as one of you is an Arab and the other is an honorary one. Yes. And the other an honorary one. And, you know, how does it feel to kind of be looking at this from quite a then Western institutionalized perspective and coming back and doing these shows? And, you know, we have all gotten to know you so much by these kind of incredible activations and shows that you do here in the region.
I mean, perhaps I can, and then maybe Sam can look a little bit at these images, but I think, you know, what's really important is to also break down a little bit this idea of what is a, you know, Western perspective or Western institutional perspective. I personally do not believe there is such a thing. There are many people that have a very different engagement with this region, people that go back and forth. My family was very often in the Middle East, actually, so we had a lot of knowledge and traveled and connections and family, friends. And so I think a lot of people are also like that. And you were just saying in London, in many ways, the exhibition that you were referring, Edge of Arabia, felt like it's coming home to an audience, you know. So, I mean, what is then the Western audience in a sense? Do you pick out some people by ethnicity that live in London or in a certain place? And the same really applies to institutions. And I'm saying this because this is a little bit actually perhaps one of the common threads in the practice and the way Sam and I curate shows, that it really is not about these cultural entry points wherever you go. It is really about that human entry point and trying to understand the artist, what are their concerns and how are they making art. And I think whenever you work, come from a different place and you are dealing with these issues of identity and other things, it is really important to actually break that down as much as possible. You know, you don't want to work with women artists because they're women artists. You don't want to work with Saudi artists because they're Saudi artists. You don't want to work in an Arab institution because it's an Arab institution. And in the same way, you don't want to work in a Western institution doing a show to a Western audience because it happens to be in London. I think the reality is a lot more complex, and it is very, very important to understand these nuances and the lived reality of many of us that are sitting here, that you have easily more than one culture embedded in you, and that needs to be acknowledged in the art and the way we talk about it.
Yeah, and I also think, to pick up on what Till is saying and Venetia is saying, one of the things that we've learned over the years, especially when we engage with artists from Saudi, from the Middle East, or other parts of the world that are considered, you know, quote unquote peripheral or not central to the discourse, central to places of artistic production, is to never use the word discover. There's a word that really, really bugs me. You know, when you go somewhere and say, oh, I discovered the art scene in Saudi Arabia. Yay, because it never existed until your eyes, you know, laid sight on it, and now bang, you activated it and it became alive and it exists. So I think one word that we prefer to use definitely is encounter. Because encounter is not about hierarchies. When you discover, you are giving a raison d'être to something by the mere act of acknowledging its existence. When you encounter, you are engaging in a conversation on an equal level. And I think this is perhaps one of the first lessons that we had to learn many years ago when we started engaging with artists anywhere. We don't discover an artist, we encounter an artist and we engage in a conversation, and based on that, so much can happen. Yes. And so much has just happened. So one of the things, let's see if I will master the art of this. Here we go. Yes. So one of the things that happened upon a very special encounter was the exhibition Safar, which Till and I curated in 2017. It was the 4th edition of Jeddah 2139. And for those of you who do not know what Jeddah 2139 is, it is an annual exhibition that was initiated several years ago by a group of art patrons, collectors, enthusiasts who believe in the artists here and who wanted to give them a platform to meet other artists, to produce new work, to engage in conversation, to meet and work with other curators and thinkers from different parts of the world. And we were the 4th edition. So we actually arrived.
You had been to see the others before and
Yes.
had kind of understood very much the context.
We had been several times, we've met many of the artists before, but this was the first time that we were putting on our hat of curating this particular exhibition. And I think for Till and I, from the very beginning, there was something very clear. So I'm going to show you this little clip and then I'll tell you what that was. We need the sound. So this just gives you a very small idea of the energy that was in that project.
So just as a little prelude to that, so for those of you who don't know, 2139 is the coordinates of Jeddah as a city, and so longitude and latitude, and then Safar means...
Exactly. So Safar was the title that we gave to the project. And I think it's because Till and I were very, very interested from the very beginning in the process and the experience. Now, for those of you who speak Arabic, you know that Safar comes from the word Safir. And Safir has a very interesting meaning. It's not just the past tense of travel, it also means revealed. When we talk about Imra'a Safira or something Safir, it means you understand it, you see it, it's clear. And this is what happens when you travel. You go from one place to another. You have certain experiences, you engage in certain things, in conversations, and then you express the result of what you have been involved in. And this is exactly the way we approached the exhibition. We wanted to create an experience that will allow the artists to engage in certain situations and then express their experience, basically, and that engagement. So for us, it was very important to actually create these travel trips, and maybe Till can tell us a little bit about where we took the artists and what we did with them.
Actually, we have one of them with us here, Rimel Nassar. So great to see you. But from the beginning, what our idea was at that time, you know, there were
when there was not a global pandemic.
There was no global pandemic, that's right. But in also, it is very important to note that, you know, there were very, very few outlets actually to see art or for artists to show their art or to study art or do things, you know. So there was Atha Gallery and Hafiz Gallery, but there were very, very few outlets actually to go and see art. And what we thought was very important actually when artists, not everybody has the means to travel and experience for financial reasons, for cultural reasons, it is a huge barrier. We thought it would be very important, instead of shipping artworks into the country and do an international thematic show, to use that budget and actually, in a sense, ship the artists out of Jeddah internationally. So what we did is that we devised a travel program instead, and we traveled with the artists. We were in Berlin, we were in South Korea, we saw several biennial exhibitions, museums, historical places, historical collections as well. And our idea was really to have a very open-ended conversations and not really work on specific projects on a theme, but really see what is it that artists are sensing and trying to help them figure out their voice and give them a bit more of an exposure to what is out there, you know, what kind of historical paintings that you normally don't have access to seeing. And that was in a nutshell our concept, as well as providing also a whole series of talks and workshops, drawing classes, painting classes, etc., for the local audience in Jeddah in the shopping mall at the time. So it was a very, very different kind of concept for an exhibition.
So I'm trying to click the, yeah. So exactly what Till was saying here, you just get a little idea of what we tried to do. We created the space in the exhibition that was about encounters, that was about conversations. Venetia was there, Alia was there, so many of you also were there. And as Till said, we created this 6-month program of different workshops and classes. Huda Abi Faris was giving topography, Ala Abu Daya was giving art history from an Arab modernism perspective. We really wanted to engage the artists in so many different ways and open the exhibition to become a source of education for the larger community. That was something very important for us. And of course, the third leg, and the clicker has about a 2-minute leg, you know, so lag behind. So the third leg was actually the exhibition itself. And I'm looking forward to seeing the next slide as much as you are. Okay. And wait for it, here it comes. So we'll give you a little snippet. This is the work that Nasser As-Salim did. I'm not going to talk about every work. I'm just going to give you quickly some installation views. The next artist is, maybe you can click from up there because it's just taking forever here. Okay, Mu'adh Al-Awfi. He did this beautiful series of mosques that were on the way between, Jeddah and Mecca. Next slide, please. Okay, Muhannad Shono, who did a beautiful installation that was part animation, part painting. Next slide, please. Majid Angawi, who did this immersive room with a light and soundscape. Next, please. Zahra Al-Ghamdi, whose work you see here in the Biennale, a land artist from Saudi.
And who spoke this morning with Sir Richard Long.
Yeah.
So please look that talk up if you haven't been here.
Bayan Abdul Latif, a photographer and designer who also designed the catalog of the exhibition. Next. So this is Reem's work. It's an image of her installation, a 2-channel video installation and a sound installation to go with it. Next. Sara Abdu. Next. So maybe we can just continue through them. Abdullah Al-Uthman.
And this was a very unique 2139 because you had all Saudi artists, because obviously that's not every year or the remit of that, but your idea was really bringing those artists out into the community. And I think that first slide that we saw with the pictures with the different communities around the world was then also exposing those communities to the artists from this country.
Yeah, I mean, at that time, like you said before, it was also impossible to get visas to come to Saudi, you know, but really, really impossible, only with very, very special permits that, you know, the members of the Saudi Art Councils have to be congratulated, I think, in many sense, to open the door for some international curators to come to Saudi Arabia, you know, even 10 years ago. But with this in mind, what we felt was incredibly important actually is to really invest entirely in the artists and making sure that whatever their needs are, they find their voice and they find this kind of tool. So it was much more than curating a show, really perhaps taking that risk and, you know, believing in them and just even involving the creative community to create the central space that you saw, the catalog, the graphic design on all aspects, basically just involving a lot of young creatives and encouraging them to work together and support one another.
So we can just continue through the slides, please. So Dana, who also has a beautiful installation, and Venetia mentioned her, Ahmed Angawi, and then I'll just give you a little wrap-up before we talk about the second project and then open up.
2139. It's not a biennale, it's not an art fair, it's finding its unique place.
they came 1 week every month to mentor them through workshops, and this is the result.
There's a lot of possibilities to experiment, to try new models.
To focus on an element of learning, of taking risks, and of exploration.
A groundbreaking exhibition. It will create a different perception on contemporary art in the kingdom.
It's become a yearly event that people wait for.
Great. So you see there were some snippets at the end, not only of Safar, but of many other events that started happening around Jeddah 2139 every year, which takes us to the point that we were raising at the beginning, that it's like a ripple effect. You throw a little pebble in a pond and the ripples go, and other people started organizing different activities, different events. Suddenly there was a talk about the mainstream and the subversive underground, which is very, very interesting that some artists were also doing things that were not in the official exhibition, but in the off project at a time when everything
was the cooler one, obviously.
Absolutely. So this kind of gives you a little bit the idea of the fascinating energy and the dynamism in which everybody throws themselves into every time there's a platform, an opportunity, a little place, a little corner to fill, a little idea. And for us, it became more than just coming here to do an exhibition. These have become friends, these have become part of an extended art family, and it was evident to us that in whatever projects we continue working on, we would love to invite some of the artists and include them in some of the other projects that we're working on, so that they can truly also engage in dialogue and conversation with other artists from different parts of the world. And we're just perhaps going to give you one example, Walking Through Walls, which is a show that we did in Berlin in 2019. So maybe Till gives you a little idea of the exhibition very quickly, and then we can show you a few slides.
Yeah, okay, so this show was basically on the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. It opened in October 2019. The wall fell in November in Germany in 1989, so this was the vision of Europe that kind of came to an end. And our idea was to really make a show about all kind of separations and walls and this, you know, these demarcation lines or divisions that continue to exist in all societies. You know, maybe Germany unified, but it doesn't mean that there are not very substantial walls, maybe not physical ones, but metaphorical walls that divide the society, that divide all of us in many, many ways. And this was just a show that was trying to capture voices of artists that were living with all kind of walls in a certain sense or separation. So it was a show with something like 32 international artists, and 2 of them were from Saudi Arabia, from our project Safar.
So here you'll see some artists, and some of them are also from the Middle East, which is what we were saying earlier.
It's an extremely powerful title because it's what we need the most at the moment. We need to pass through the walls that we are building and walls that's being built against us. It's a kind of a poetic or an artistic approach to do so.
There is a tension between wall and walking, but at the same time they belong together. There wouldn't be a wall if it wasn't to block the walking. There wouldn't be a walking if not because you need to break curtains and go from one place to the other.
On the one hand, it's really abstract when you consider walls as some kind of barrier or something which is in your way. But on the other hand, it's very concrete, something which surrounds you, which gives you shelter.
It's very charged, the location, and taking in consideration the location of Martin Gropius Borg, in the sense that where it's placed, kind of parallel to the Berlin Wall.
For me, the walls
have invaded every layer of our daily life.
I'm so glad about this theme, Walking Through Walls. I believe that it will happen to change something.
The main values societies must try to build are not the ones protected by walls, but compassion, real love. There are values that are much more important. Walking Through Walls is the future.
So this just gives you an idea of the artists that were in the show and how many of them were from the region, but also Reem and Zahra Al-Ghamdi, whose work is in the Biennale. So the idea was actually to contextualize the artists and stop talking, in a sense, perhaps predominantly, or our first point of entry is nationality, but to actually allow different artists from different places to engage in an idea that's very pertinent, that's very current, that has a certain resonance with a historical moment that has divided an entire continent, if not the entire world, but to see what it means for us today to reflect on these questions of division and separation. So from a local to a global and to a continuous encounter, not discovery, with artists that we respect and admire and hope to continue working with for many years. Thank you so much.
And if anyone has any questions, please feel free. You know, we'll have a little Q&A time at the end, but if there's something particularly burning, ask us. And I think, you know, really that idea, of course we see regional shows, or you see, you know, a thematic show about a part of the world, or, you know, women artists, as we said, or, you know, artists of the Middle East, or Saudi artists in the case of Edge of Arabia. But then we also see these situations like reflections in a way, or let's say word into art in a way, where it's about a theme or about a subject rather than an ethnicity or a gender. And this show, Walking Through Walls, and I think it's what we heard from Phil earlier about the Biennale, is about these dialogues and conversations related to a subject. And that is something that does bring down those barriers and allows you to cross and walk through a wall, or to cross the river by feeling the stones, and to put those artists in context. So maybe a little conversation from the three of you of your experiences working with the Saudi artists here, putting them into the global scene, the title of our conversation, but how it differs, you know, having a conversation with them amongst them, but then having a conversation with them abroad.
I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, I generally do not think that you can always distill, you know, maybe there's something specific about Saudi artists or Arab artists. I think this is always an impossible task. In the end, you know, they are as different as people can be anywhere else in the world. And I don't really think that there's a specific thing that they do here. But however, what I will say is perhaps that I think in a country where you, at the moment, have a lot of institutions that are being conceived and are emerging, but you do not have a lot of possibilities for artists to actually have dialogues in physical spaces or in more established institutions to present their works, and in collections to maybe study what artists were doing 5 years or 10 years ago. The exchange happens much more virtually than it does in many other places in the world. So a lot of artists are constantly in communication on social media, on Instagram, on YouTube and other media.
Highest social media rate per capita in the world.
That's right. So, and I think that definitely has a sort of a certain effect, I would say, on how artists see and look at work, you know, and how do you connect. There's also a much greater ease to connect globally and follow people what they are doing globally. You know, may not travel to see work physically installed in museums and institutions, but I think there's a complete fluidity that also extends the media that artists work in. You know, you don't have these rigid divisions, you know, that is a visual artist and this is a filmmaker, or this is someone that works in, you know, in crafts. It actually blends in much more fluidly, and I think therein lies a fantastic opportunity for artists here and for these institutions to actually conceive structures and institutions that truly are grown locally and that are not simply copying, you know, a 19th century model maybe for many cities in Europe. While they work very well there, I think there's a great deal to learn from here as well. How can maybe a scene even though it's a lot of top-down approach at the moment, but there is a massive wave that is much stronger than I think what's coming top-down, what artists and people are doing themselves, the young creatives. There's a lot to be learned from, and how do they connect, how do they promote their works, how do they create works, how do they find communities, is something that I think we can all learn a great deal from.
I think one of the things that's really interesting is that so much of this work can be seen in multiple contexts. So, you know, you can see Dana's work, for example, in the context of this, you know, this international Biennale, but you can also, so some of the work that I do is placing them within a context of, say, the Islamic art collections, but you know, also to show that actually there is a lot beyond that, and it's not Islamic anyway. So I found it really interesting to try and make these juxtapositions, actually, so that you can see these artists in lots of different contexts. So, for example, I see Khalil here. So in our gallery at the British Museum, the end wall is this incredible work which is called Faces by Khalil and Joanna. But you know, further down the gallery, you'll see the art of the Safavids and the Ottomans and all of that. So I think it's really interesting actually to take the works in a different context, because sometimes it's really quite important, or it's just one level, to know that, for example, Dana's work or Lulu's work is connected. In the case of Lulu, it's the 99 Names of God, but it's actually pure abstraction as well. So you can see it in different contexts, and sometimes it's important to know that, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes just knowing that is, you know, an added layer. But also something like Khalil's work, you know, it injects a note of reality. You know, it's actually, that is about the Lebanese civil war, and you know, look at where we are with Lebanon today. So I think that's also quite interesting, is that a lot of these works have got very important points to make, both regionally and actually internationally as well.
Yeah, and I think, Sam, maybe help finish us off, because I see the time running out. That, of course, you know, and as Till said, you know, what makes a Saudi artist any different, you know, from an international context, but it's also about the context in which you grow up. We just talked about Joanna and Khalil in the Civil War. I mean, that was a defining moment that was lived only in Lebanon. So a Lebanese artist of a certain age will have to reference that, not have to, but will be compelled to reference that, because that is what they grew up with. A young Saudi artist right now, I can imagine, will be referencing this moment of deeply positive change in this country, because that is what they're living.
Absolutely, and I think the word reference is key in this particular situation, and it's kind of one of the lines that underscore a lot of what we do, not only in terms of what artists reference in their work, but how do you change the public's points of reference when they encounter and receive the work. And I think this is something that we are all doing in different ways. I think, for instance, when I walked into the Biennale yesterday with Till, one of the first things we saw was this beautiful Muhammad Salim painting, which we had shown in 2018 in Art Dubai in an exhibition called That Feverish Leap, you know, to the Fierceness of Life, based on the manifesto of the Iraqi Baghdad school, modern school, which we had learned about from Nada Shabbout. And Nada Shabbout had told us about something which she had read that was written by somebody else a few years ago. So the idea is that it's kind of a succession, it's a kind of domino effect. You do one thing here, and then somebody else does something somewhere else. They pick on something you've done, and then it goes and changes context. You see it in a different way. And ultimately, it becomes less of a novelty that I'm reading a list of artists' names and I see, you know, I don't know, like Marina Abramovic, Cindy Sherman, Riemann Nasser, and then I continue and I don't even blink, because it's not so out of this world that there's an Arab name or a Saudi name in that list or in that exhibition. The points of reference have changed because the context has been changed in which the artwork has been shown over so many places and so many times. And I think this is exactly what it means to open up the local and create a dialogue with the global. It's about expanding a canon, it's about changing people's points of reference and allowing us to celebrate the story with all its diversity and all its facets.
Perhaps maybe just one more thing to add. I think it is also very important to look at the history of 2139 as maybe some sort of prequel, I mean, which existed actually before the Ministry of Culture was formed in the country. So I think there was a very, very lucky constellation of some incredible patrons of the arts. You know, we have some here with us, you know, Sarah, Faisal, Ranim, who set up this body that actually had the vision to believe in the power of the arts, you know, on a really grassroots level, finding an empty shopping mall space that would actually house not just an exhibition annually, but many, many other programs. And I think that sort of vision, you know, at a time when you didn't even think that these kind of things could happen here, when it was not so
mixed audiences,
not so clear where you would meet in public. That's right. Where could young creators meet? You know, where could a young designer meet a client? In these questions.
Studio or other.
Yeah, but even well, none of these places existed at the time. So I think there's a lot of credit that should go to that actually, to in a certain way maybe pave the way. And I think now with all these really big initiatives that are happening, there is an incredible value also of having some sort of counterpoints. You know, a lot of things are happening in Riyadh. It is incredibly important that things also happen in other parts of the kingdom, and other initiatives continue.
Jamil, of course, and the opening of Hay, which will be, you know, this creative hub, and, you know, house also in a very unusual way, be, you know, a kind of nonprofit space foundation, but also a cinema, also housing commercial galleries. So something that's also very unique to, you know, this ecosystem, this place, and being able to be that hybrid. And, you know, just a kind of maybe final touch point is that we know the closing of the Biennale will be March 11th, which will coincide with Venisha's 2139. So that will be one of the next great activations, and a really important, I think, as Till just said, that this important thing that happens is, you know, something that has also followed on from Edge of Arabia, also followed on from the Mansouriya Foundation, and these happenings over the years that then, you know, evolve, and here we go, we have the Biennale, this incredibly important moment, but then acknowledging very much the importance of 2139 at the same time, and hopefully getting to see Venisha's show then.
Yes, well, I hope you'll all be there. But actually,
can we know the title?
Yes, well, I think I can reveal the title, which is called Amakin. So I think, but I'm not going to reveal anything else. You'll have to just come and see it. But it is. I just want to just say very quickly what a huge privilege that is to have been invited to do that, because it is an extraordinary group of people who've created this, but also the freedom that you have, and then the encounter with these artists is just absolutely magical. And it has to be said that you know, during this Corona era, you know, this was the one thing that kept me going. Actually, was the kind of weekly meetings, you know, on Zoom and all that with the artists.
And you and Phil, I remember, had a very early conversation to make sure that the audiences here, the global audience, but also the local audience, you know, would be seeing new and different things, and they would be complementary to each other between the Biennale and 2139. But of course, you know, nothing the same. So on that note, if we have any questions from the audience. Oh, we have two here.
I think they don't work together, a mask and a microphone. Well, thank you for this wonderful presentation. If you will allow me to be the devil's advocate, a little bit here, agitator.
Of course.
The panel before us, which was all in Arabic, of course, actually used words like asala and turath, authenticity, heritage, in sort of speaking of a Saudi identity of sorts, of how to form Saudi art. Now, the question is, and you guys were talking about putting Saudi artists in a global scene and starting conversations. So how do we think about the contrast of what's happening between some of the local art practitioners, art education specifically in the universities, which is a whole different thing, themes that, whether at MISC or other places that are identity and home, which are very popular at the moment, as there seemed to be that search. So the question basically is, how can one perhaps have or enter into a global conversation when one has not mastered a local language yet?
Well, I think maybe I can answer something quickly to that. I think it's a great question. I think when the panel that happened previously in Arabic, many of these artists were working in a time when you simply were not exposed also to this massive flood of images and exposures globally, because there were simply not the speed of which you could access, you know, through Instagram or websites. You don't even have to travel in many ways to see what's happening, what are the trends in other parts of the world. And I think that is ever so increasing. So when it comes, what I'm trying to say is the question nowadays, when you try to find a local language, I think it's almost impossible to separate that from a global flood of images and trends and concerns that are happening. The corona pandemic is a great example of something that affects everyone around the world. Climate change, social change, everything is much, much more at least visibly connected. It might have been before, but now you simply cannot avoid it. So when it comes to having these global talks or global exchanges, I think it's really one and the same nowadays. You know, when you have these global exchange in a local language, I think it's becoming really one in many, many ways. And I think if there's one thing that we did notice here in Saudi is that many of the artists are perhaps more in tune even what's happening in other parts of the world, and they are certainly more in tune about what's happening in Europe than people are in Europe knowledgeable about what is happening in Saudi or in other parts of the Arab world. So I think if anything there's more of a curiosity or more of a global outlook that is at the same becoming part of, in a sense, a local language of the artists here.
We have just one last question for Raneem.
That was Nada, right? Hi, Nada. If I may just add onto that answer to Nada, is I don't see them as something that's completely separate. I mean, whilst someone is still in search of their, specifically with artistic practice, since like an artist is still searching for their identity, that does not mean that simultaneously they cannot be exposed into something more of a global context. I feel like it's not one or the other, it's actually, and that's happening, I mean, we've witnessed that all around the world, not just with our artists, where they evolve, they discover themselves while still positioning themselves locally and globally. So I just wanted to add that part. But I also wanted to ask a question. Sorry. I wanted to just, Till, you mentioned something about our collective and how we started, and that's the grassroots part. But I just wanted to fix one small part of information, is that there was Ministry of Culture back then, but it was Ministry of Culture and Information, just so you know it doesn't get misperceived. It's just that this just shows that the importance of collectiveness, and that one is more of like, you know, there's a top-bottom kind of approach and there's a bottom-top approach, and that's when we create some sort of a healthy formula of when the continuity of what started, and we're just continuing what happened and adding more support to the ecosystem to assist in the kind of expediting the buildup of the infrastructure, to really kind of fill in the gaps and not wait. So everyone's taking multiple roles on to ensure that we're providing the best to the society. And then now the question comes. You mentioned the modern show that you guys created at Art Dubai. And I was very curious because that was one of the things that really kind of put that on the map that we're actually discussing now. And I just wanted to ask you on how did people perceive that? Like if you would share, you know, some perceptions and some reactions to some of these works, because this was what I think we all touched upon as to, it's not coming out of nowhere. There's like this era that a lot of people may not know much about, and maybe that was a revealance to many. So would appreciate if you could share some insight on that.
Sure, and I'll try to be very brief, which is always a challenge. Basically, the exhibition was looking at 5 different schools from different cities, 5 cities in the Arab world, 5 decades. So there was the Casablanca school, there was the group of contemporary art from Cairo, there was the Sudan Khartoum school, there was the group of artists around Salim and Abd al-Rahman Suleiman in Dar al-Funun in Riyadh, and there was a 4th, and there was also a 5th school, which now, the Baghdad School of Modern Art. So the idea was to look at 5 schools and 5 different kind of movements that were centered around certain questions, and how these questions were manifested and what kind of resolutions these artists had in their practice to be able to tackle some of the issues that felt very important for them. And ironically, this was exactly on the cusp of that moment of, is it global, is it local? There were a lot of post-colonial realities going on in so many of these places, so there was a mining of local traditions and vernaculars to create a language that seemed authentic, to go back to Asala, but also to respond to the contemporary moment at the time. And within that context, we were looking at that group of artists in Saudi who were articulating a specific language that was at once responding to the local immediate concerns, but also seeking to be in dialogue with other practices from the region and beyond, because they were inviting artists to come and exhibit with them also from Italy, from the UK, from the Arab world in that space here in Riyadh. So the response was very, very, of course, oh my God, there were artists in Saudi, at the, the typical, but you brush off that one very, very quickly. But then the more interesting and serious response was, what can we learn from this? And I think this is what excites us all. How can an exhibition or a presentation, a publication, change a perception and push us to ask, what can I learn from this? How can I change my own prejudice about a certain place, a certain culture, a certain artistic lineage? So to see Mohammed Salim in the Biennale, thank you, Phil, that's amazing. To see that Abdurrahman Suleiman has been in every auction in Sotheby's and Christie's, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. Probably he's very happy, I just saw him now. But this only happens when you engage genuinely. You have to go, you have to spend time, you have to visit these artists in their studios, engage in long-term conversations, and just let the rest take its course and see what happens.
Well, thank you so much to my 3 wonderful speakers who are really part of the foundation of this system. And even if you weren't around at the early days of these artists who were in the early 20th century, you have definitely been a big part of allowing people to encounter them in new contexts. And so I invite all of you, please, to go into feeling the stones and please encounter things and remember them and then take them back and let them proliferate. Thank you.
Thank you, Alia, so much for your beautiful chairing. Thank you.